represent the interests of the peasants. The infiltrators were not only considered misleading but also violent. Their presence controverted the civilian character of the strike and placed it in a warlike framework. In other words, the infiltrators could be insurgents belonging to armed groups. This counter-insurgent logic was shared by the right-wing camp, and with this interpretation, the government justified the harsh police repression of the demonstration. During the first week of protest, the government subordinated dialogue to the unblocking the roads. At the end of the first day of protests, President Juan Manuel Santos say that the demonstration had not been of the magnitude expected. As the day passed, the scale of the mobilization increased, and protesters and commentators questioned the government's failure to take on board the real importance of was happening. On 25 August, Santos reiterated that the strike was not on the scale that its organizers claimed, but was a challenge to public order by a small group of illegitimate actors seeking to sow chaos. Televised address, in the televised address, he stated that, quote, this national agrarian strike does not exist. This last phrase generated a strong controversy. Although peasant action had found social recognition, it had not managed to that solidarity actors in the audiences commit directly to the development of the conflict. President's words had precisely that effect. They were followed by a wave of collective indignation. On the evening of 25 August, residents of Tunja, Boyaca's capital, the main center of the protest, took to the streets and gathered in the main square to demonstrate their support for the peasants by cacerolazos, a repertory of protests in which demonstrators take to the streets or lean out of the windows and repeatedly bang a saucepan, cacerola, or other metal utensils with kitchen cutlery. The next day, the cacerolazos were replicated in other cities. In Bogota, citizens met in the Plaza de Bolívar, the nation's political center, and repeated the rallies for several days in a row. Alongside the demonstrations in the public space, trends of support were positioned through digital social networks. Because of the fragmentation and polarization of the Colombian society, this solidarity was made possible by a process of symbolic coalition. The peasants achieved support from different sectors because they symbolize common reference through good narratives that connected fragmented audiences. The first narrative treated the peasantry as an actor with deep-rooted links to the population, stemming from its place as a protagonist in the founding and sustaining of social life. Urban demonstrators and columnists recalled the role of the peasantry in the country's independence process. The role in national economic development was also reiterated. The threat to the peasant way of life was seen as a threat to the whole nation. Finally, the primordial character of the peasantry was referred to the intimate sphere of the family. The peasantry was considered an ancestor deserving of respect and fair treatment. The second narrative focused on the peasantry as a victim of inequality, exclusion, violence, and all kinds of injustice situations. In these situations, a protest considered legitimate was justified. In Special Espirri, a documentary program broadcast on national television, the presenter rhetorically asked his audiences if the peasants' reaction did not seem natural to them. Quote, won't you be angry? Won't you be desperate? Won't you go out and
Five
protest? Well,
minutes. 10 minutes.
thanks. Thanks. Well, the peasants got fed up and went out to protest. Unquote. Furthermore, in reference to the staging of the strike, the riot police directly embodied violence against the peasantry. This idea of victimization was contrasted with the script of insurgent infiltration of the strike. The symbolic coalition contributed to sustaining the interpretation of the agrarian strike as a citizen action, despite the outbreak of moments of violence during the protests. Peasantry and government embodied the opposition between aspirations for inclusion in a democratic framework and policies of exclusion under an authoritarian model. While liberal sectors conceived the strike as a democratic protest, right?
Sorry, Juan, we can hear you. Juan?
Can you hear me now?
Now, yes. Go ahead.
Yes.
Yes.
You see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. The symbolic coalition contributes to sustaining the interpretation of the agrarian strike as a citizen action, despite the outbreak of moments of violence during the protests. Peasantry and government embodied the opposition between aspirations for inclusion in a democratic framework and policies of exclusion under an authoritarian model, while liberal sectors conceived the strike as a democratic protest, right-wing actors classified it as a civilized protest, and left-wing leaders as a mass mobilization. For his part, the president embodied the negative attributes of all these tendencies: authoritarian, arbitrary, and deceitful for liberals, weak in the face of bandits, arrogant and disrespectful for right-wing actors, and bourgeois and subservient to transnational imperialism from the left-wing point of view. The Solidarity performance constituted a public staging of the symbolic coalitions. Both the president's strike and the citizen action in cities that supported constituted a milestone in the recent process of the rise of social protests in Colombia. Despite the persistence of our like classification framework, protests of all kinds of sectors during the last decade have received strong support based on the interpretation that they are civil actions. The growth of a civil discourse has contributed to overcome discussions about the insurgent or citizens' character of the protesters, and therefore to positioning in the public debate the demands about inequality. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Juan Camilo Portela Garcia, for the presentation and to fit exactly the time we provide for your presentation. So in order to advance some questions you want, you can write in the in the chat, or wait to the end of the three presentation to follow with your questions. The second presenter is Mehmet Fuat Kina from Koch University, and Mehmet, okay.
Hi, let me share my screen first. Can you see my screen now?
Perfectly, yeah.
Okay. Hello again. My name is Fuat, Mehmet Fuat, and I am fourth year PhD candidate at Koç University Sociology Department. My research is about contentious politics in rural India and three dynamics of rural conflict in India. And Demanding Matters is a brief trailer of my findings. Here is the most recent abstract of my research, which mainly analyzes a mobilization government policy nexus throughout the radical Maoist Naxalite movement, which I consider as a bunch of massive social movements belonging to a similar tradition from armed militancy to peaceful demonstrations and parliamentary actions. The NREGA program, it is the largest social welfare provision in the world, and the land dispossessions under the umbrella of special economic zones, which the Naxalites declare a fight, since they have historically induced huge grievances for the rural poor. And empirically, I showed that the Indian decision makers has employed the NREGA provision to demobilize the Naxalites and to compensate for rural land dispossessions, named as substitution pieces that I will mention shortly after. And the findings show the opposite. The Naxalites have reversed this demobilizing impact of the NREGA program by framing the scheme, the provision, as a collective action demand. Here you see the subtopics of my literature section. Let me briefly summarize what substitution thesis argues. We conceptualized and empirically showed the details of substitution thesis in another co-authored paper on a rural conflict in Brazil, which is under revision nowadays. Substitution basically resembles concession, but has a very significant difference. It is based on a scenario that in the conflict between the government and a social movement, government systematically directs a policy other than what movement demands. And it is another benevolent policy. And government implements this benevolent policy while systematically unmeeting the demand. In this paper on Brazilian rural conflict, we showed that Brazilian government demobilized rural unrest by distributing more social assistance to unrest, since both repression and concession, sending more police forces or giving land reforms, increased mobilization more and more. Therefore, we define substitution as a third governmental response, in addition to repression and concession. The reason for substitution is that concession has a huge risk of escalating the mobilization, since it justifies the movement's prognostic frames, and success might increase the collective desire for further success. But substitution mainly aims to dismantle this feeling of success to demobilize social movements. I will present mobilization government policy nexus in the next slides, and for the rest of the subtopics, I can summarize those in 2 sentences. First, the impact of Naxalites on the NREGA is not much studied before, and second, the impact of NREGA on the Naxalites is a pretty famous question, but again, not much studied by social movement scholars mainly. Often security and terror scholars worked on this direction of causality and frequently reduced the Naxalites to a single armed violent terrorist group and focused on the tactics of official authorities to pacify the movements. So missed very important mobilizational dynamics. That's why what I argue in the paper. The MGP nexus, mobilization government policy nexus, depends on the idea that whether a policy is a substitute or a concession depends on to what extent the movement demands it. And there is a continuity from the concession to substitution scenarios. DS in the figure shows the MGP curve for substitution, and it has a negative slope since the movement doesn't make claims for that policy yet. It is the most common case for social assistance programs, for example, all around the world maybe, since they are rarely demanded generally by the social movements. However, by making claims, creating a demanding discourse on that policy, maybe blaming the authorities for the corruption or insufficient implementation, social movements can transform substitution to concession, for which, for concession, we have a positive slope. That means it is prone to increase further mobilization of the movement. And here are my research questions and hypotheses. I basically want to learn the response of Indian governments towards the Naxalite mobilization. And second, whether this move of government worked. So I have 3 hypotheses. First, I expect to find NREGA is more likely distributed to Naxal-related districts. Second, the NREGA and the SCZ projects are positively associated. And third, the NREGA is expected to have a mobilizing effect on the Naxalites. Here is the design of the rest of the paper. I constructed a novel panel data set, district level yearly based from 2006 to 2014. I used an original database of Glocon. It is used for the first time in this research. It is a global database on contentious political events. It's an outcome of an ERC project that I have been working during the last 4 years. You can find the details in the webpage. Further, I made a list of all factions and front organizations of the Naxalites and searched the list among the organizer categories of the events, instead of focusing only the keyword of Naxal or Maoist, or filtering violent events like previous researchers often did. For empirical models, for both sides of the interaction, I used IV2SLS instrumental variable approach and presented my results in the same order with the hypothesis and provided mechanisms for those. As shown in the table, Naxalites have a positive impact on the NREGA person days. The number of Naxalite events have a positive impact on NREGA person days distributed by the governments. I'm skipping model specification details for now, but for each model in the paper, I run few robustness tests using alternative NREGA variables, alternative Naxalite variables, such as subcategories of events as violent, non-violent, rural, and urban events, etc., and controlled for spatial and temporal autocorrelation and some further control variables. And in substitution models, you can see that the amount of the CZ area and the amount of special economic zone projects and NREGA person days are positively associated, although we control for major predictors of the dependent variables, which means that the government directed the NREGA to compensate land dispossessions, what Naxalites try to fight against. And the SEZs have been rarely denotified. My assumption also holds for the SEZ denotifications. And finally, mobilization models show that the NREGA has a positive direct effect, positive effect on the Naxalite mobilization. A robustness test for these models also proves its strength. I run another instrumental variable analysis for this causal direction to make sure about this finding, but couldn't present it here due to time and space limitations. In the paper, I plan to have a debate on the potential mechanisms.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. Thank you. So I also try to discuss on potential mechanisms for each hypothesis, trying to respond some why and how questions about those. But due to limitations, again, I will only mention about the last hypothesis here. I carried out a qualitative analysis of Liberation Journal of CPI ML Liberation faction of the Naxalites and found that after few years of the NREGA's the provisions introduction, they continuously issued the problems related to the provision in their journal. While provisions provides 100 days of employment, they have frequently asked for more days of employment. They have organized demonstrations to demand more NREGA provisions and protested the corruption under the program. Instead of blaming the program itself, they blamed the government and framed the program as a result of their fight. That is what I observe in their documents. And this constitutes the explanation, my explanation behind the mobilizing impact of NREGA on the Naxalites. So it becomes a concession while defined as a collective action demand. And the NREGA was initially a substitute policy. However, the Naxalites have successfully transformed the NREGA from a substitution to a concession and accordingly gained new mobilization advantages. So the main contribution of my research is the NGP nexus. I believe that it works to understand the contention between the government and the movement better. And second, my research introduces the Glocon database, which helped to cover all front organizations of the Naxalites in that case, unlike previous research that only focused on smaller armed militancy activation. Third, my models control for reverse causality problem in a reliable manner. Finally, I can conclude that the political containment strategy of Indian government is not only directed at the unrest, but also at land dispossessions, which was one of the main reasons for the unrest. And the Naxalites, having a collective agency, developed successful counter strategies to reverse the impact of governmental efforts. And that's all I have. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Mehmet. Thanks again for strictly use the time allocated to you, your presentation. And okay, let's move to the last speaker of this fifth session. Is Camilo Tamayo Gomez from the University of Huddersfield. Camilo.
Thank you, Benjamin. I'm going to try to share my screen. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So thank you, Benjamin, and thank you everyone for attending this session. What I'm going to do the next 15 minutes is to present some preliminary results of a research that I have been doing since 2021, when these Colombian protests started in Colombia in the context of the pandemic. I have presented different results in different conferences, but I'm going to focus on the link between collective actions, bodies of resistance, and solidarity for this midterm conference. So just to give you the road of my presentation, I'm going to split this presentation in two moments. The first part, I'm going to give a little bit of context about the 2021 Colombian mobilizations. It's really good that Juan Camilo has provided some context before, because these mobilizations are a little bit different with what Juan Camilo was explaining, because that was before the peace agreement, and these mobilizations were after the peace agreement. So I'm going to explain a bit more about this. And in the second part, I'm just going to present some ideas as some preliminary results that I had been collecting and reflecting in regards to the Colombian protests and the links with these three categories. So just really quickly, the context about the in 2016, the Colombian government made a peace agreement with one of the most important guerrillas in the history of Colombia, the FARC. And for some scholars, for some people, they agreed that there was the end of more than 60 years of civil war in Colombia and start a new moment of Colombian history. So after 6 decades of conflict, different bodies, including the Truth Commission, the National Historic Commission, they say that after 6 decades, the 20% of the population was a direct victim of the war. So this is really striking, because that shows the negative outcome of this conflict in terms of human bodies, of course, of human lives, but in terms of how they create a huge problem for social cohesion, the social structure of Colombia, and the life of people in the country in general. So I'm going to give you some examples of some data, what happened with the outcome. Of course, 9 million internally displaced people, more than 40,000 kidnappings, 200,000 for disbarments, and so on. But what is important here about this context is like the demonstrations that I'm going to explain a little bit was happening during this transition period. So after the peace agreement, and this is going to be really interesting to see the connection between this society in transition after being from the civil war and now in this transitional period of trying to create a new social contract in the country after the peace agreement. So in 2021, different protests start in Colombia during the pandemic because and as a result of a governmental proposal for a tax reform. So Ivan Duque Marquez, the actual president of Colombia, he tried to do this tax reform during the pandemic, and that was the catalyzer of a lot of social discontent and a lot of social and political demonstrations in the street. So the argument for the president to do this tax reform was that that measure will overcome Colombia's economic crisis and that can mitigate the post-pandemic unemployment. But once again, the interesting is like the confluence of these two dynamics, if you want, the pandemic and of course the post-conflict society. So that tax reform was not really well received by the Colombian population because they targeted middle classes earners, and some people argue that were affecting the poorest of Colombia and were not trying to redistribute the taxes and economic responsibilities between all Colombians. So this reform was really controversial. And as I say, they start to catalyze in protests. In April, 4 days of protests start. After 4 days of protests, the government withdrew the proposal. But as I say, that was like the catalyzer, the main motivation for people to start demonstrating and claiming for more broader issues, including economical reforms, distribution of wealth, against police brutality, unemployment, and so on. So that was like the perfect storm, if you want to see, to start claiming for a new changes, structural changes in the country. And of course, again, this mix between the transition period and what was happening during the pandemic. So the this Colombian protest is interesting because it's the first time that rural and urban collectives start to come together to demonstrate. And the recent history was one of the most serious public unrest. So that's really interesting. But the government and especially the police forces react in a really bad matter. And after some research by NGOs, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, 68 people die as a result of the police brutality. And so, of course, that raised a lot of questions about how the police is using the same tactics they used to do during the armed conflict now in this transition period. But that was awful, to be absolutely honest, because the response for the police was the extreme use of violence, and different repertoire of violence start to become more public, like gender-based violence, sexual assault, rape, sleeping and verbal abuse. So the police behave in a way that was, of course, undermining social cohesion, but of course, giving this kind of, a lack of trust again in the government and in the police forces. So at the end, at this moment, say that some organizations, NGOs, said that almost 500, I need to update that number, 500 people still been missing as a result of these mobilizations. So once again, just to highlight two issues. One, that was this protest is really important because it was the first moment, if you want, like the urban and rural populations start to come together, and finally young people start to be at the core of the demonstration. So you can see like the new generation of activists and people involved in social movements and collective actions came to life. So what I tried to do, and I'm still trying to do, and this is part of the project, was to analyze these demonstrations in two different levels. One is trying to analyze the materialities of the protest, and the second level is trying to analyze the normativities of the protest. I have presented in other places that you have been with me different aspects like social disobedience, collective actions, and so on. But I'm going to focus today in the role of collective actions and something that I call the spaces and places of the body. So just what I'm going to say is like what you're going to see is the reflection of this dialogue between the materialities of the collective action, the normativities of the collective action, and how this dynamic can shape places, spaces, and bodies during the demonstrations. What can we learn about these dynamics, and of course how these materialities and normativities can have a link with the pandemic in general and social categories like resistance and solidarity. So the first part was to analyzing the places of resistance and start to see this reconfiguration between spatiality, location, and collective action. And one thing that for me was really interesting to analyze what the places that all these collective actions start to happen in Colombia, and the transformation as a result of the collective action of these places of just like a social collectivity to places of resistance. One example is in Cali, what is one of the most important cities in Colombia. And it's a place called Puerto Rellena, or used to be called Puerto Rellena, a really poor neighborhood in Colombia. And as a result of the social dynamics and the collective actions, they start to become a place of resistance called Puerto Resistencia, like a port of resistance. But this is just to show you a little bit the consequences of these dynamics of materialities and the change of places and relation with the space. Another example is in Bogota, that comes from Portal de las Americas, a place that for the local transport, to change to a place called Portal of Resistencia. So once again, is how the changes in the terms of place. What in terms with the monuments, you can see some pictures about the reconfiguration of this place and the place, and of course the resistant dynamics that brings collective action together. So you can see the reconfiguration of monuments in Colombia, public spaces, and of course different kind of narratives referring with the outcomes of the Colombian armed conflict, like the 6,402 people that were killed by the army during the Colombian conflict, calling the falsos positivos. But it's just to show you some examples about the reconfigurations of these places of resistance. Activism in public spaces, like once again transforming the place as a collective place of resistance against the war and what happened, of course, in the past, but just try to create awareness about the mobilizations and the importance of these new ways of collective actions. We can see the use of graffitis and murals and activism in public spaces with narratives like the state is an assassin and the state is killing, and of course like the government behaving like a psychopath body, as you see, or like a psychopath actor because of these whole actions of police brutality. And you can see, of course, different examples of this activism in public spaces referring with the outcomes of the Colombian armed conflict. I will share this presentation with you because I'm aware that I have 4 minutes to end. Another place of resistance was the open roads, and they become a place of resistance in terms of roadblocks. So that's transformed across Colombia. Thank you, Benjamin. And how these places become as well places of collective action and resistance. The second dimension is the spaces of solidarity and how these materialities and these performativities reconfigure social dynamics. And I can just highlight 2 particular places, like the Minga, like the indigenous population coming together to create a space of solidarity to create collective action and help the demonstrations. The construction and development of ollas comunitarias, community kitchens across Colombia, just to bring people together and express civil solidarity during the demonstrations. And the bodies of resistance and how the bodies of demonstrators become a really important symbol and actor during the demonstrations, and it's the case of the first line protesters, young people exposing their bodies against the police in order to protect demonstrators, and how the police targeting the eyes of demonstrators as a way to exercise police brutality. And this has some similarities with the case of Chile and Ecuador, and this makes me wonder the role of the police during these protests. And finally, one idea that I want to bring to you is like how the bodies can be seen as a kind of trace or marks of these actions of police brutality, and how these corporabilities can be seen as a way to create collective action as well. So 3 primary conclusions, and of course I will be more than happy to discuss these ideas with you, is first of all the intersection between the symbolic reconfiguration of public spaces, streets, squares, public roads during the protest, and the impact of police violence on demonstrators' bodies. And it's how it's showing new / old dimensions of collective action, but it's how the body become a place of resistance and a public space and side of civic solidarity. So I know that this is not a new idea, but I want you to try to understanding this idea on this new approach post-pandemic, and of course the role of place and space and so on. The second conclusion is how these acts of collective action are showing new expressions of citizenship for the country after the war. So I want to explore, I want to analyze how this transitional period that is experienced in Colombia can be catalyze new expressions of citizenship, and especially new forms of collaborative and collective action. And finally, the performativity as a method to contest violence, power, and other forms of social order, ACA, or before like the armed conflict, and now how the country is experiencing the I was thinking like the new kind of social contract for the country after these dynamics of recognition, solidarity, and social cohesion that these government protests catalyze again in the case. So thank you for listening to me, and looking forward to hear your questions. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thank you again very much, Camilo, for strictly adapt to the time. And we have some minutes for questions and consideration. We have announcing a hand. Alexander, Kate, go ahead.
Hi, Camilo, and thank you very much indeed for that fascinating presentation. It was very impressive to see such large numbers of people on the streets. But what we saw mostly there was streets, squares, roads. And I'm wondering whether that reflects a certain kind of urban bias in the character of the protests or in the reporting of the protests. Or is it that somehow or other people from rural areas, sometimes quite deep rural areas, if I understand it properly, in Colombia, how do they get to the squares? How do they protest in urban areas alongside urban people, whether they're workers, students, or whatever? Maybe I can reformulate this in terms of a notion which I developed for understanding protests in South Africa, which was one of the relations of the means to protest. And that's been used by another scholar with regard to Burkina Faso. So are there different kinds of protests that are associated with, on the one hand, workers, perhaps strikes, workplaces, and so on? Secondly, people from poorer areas, or perhaps middle-class people who are protesting in the city centres and so forth, and then people in the rural areas perhaps protesting differently. So what are the differences within these different milieux, and what is it that brings them together?
Thanks, Kate. I think that both Camilos can answer the question. Yeah.
Yeah, I have some answers already, but I don't know if Juan Camilo wants to provide some insights first, and I can just, of course, provide some ideas.
I prefer Camilo, you first, because your protest is the recent one. I prefer your first.
Okay. Thank you, Juan Camilo. So thank you, Kate, for this interesting question. When you say about the urban bias, I think at least one thing that struck me was that was one of the first moments in common history that the rural world, if you want, connect with the urban world in terms of the dynamics of the protesters. Usually in Colombia, the protesters are in the main streets or in the main squares of urban cities. But what we saw in these demonstrations were like people in the small communities start to demonstrate the local parks, for example, in the roads, in places when the community came together to do everyday activities, like commercial activities, educational activities. But once again, was like trying to reclaim the public space, small spaces of public space. But in order to create disruption, the rural communities expressed just blocking the roads. And I guess that is really, really interesting, because it was not the usual dynamic to go to the main square and demonstrating, but they tried to create, of course, disruption in different kind of ways, but just trying to connect with the main way that happened in Colombia. Saying this, it's just kind of trying to say that this new dynamic is showing a more interesting dialogue between the rural and the urban communities in Colombia. Some scholars argue maybe it's because the centrality of new forms of communication, maybe Facebook, social media, and so on. I think that can be seems important. But I guess it was like the pandemic was something that affect all Colombians. So I guess that connect as well. It was something that was not like, I don't know, the armed conflict that some people were directly affected. But now the pandemic, because it was affecting everyone, I guess this sense of connection, this kind of sense of, I don't know, communality, if you want, because they were experiencing the same, create these waves of resignify the public space, the small public spaces. But I think, just to conclude, I'm sorry to take so long, it's like I think it's a connection between the closing of the roads and the reclamation of small public spaces in local communities, and the reconfiguration of monuments and big spaces for urban areas. But of course, is this just a really preliminary talk? And I know that Juan Camilo can help me to provide more reflections.
Thanks, Camilo. I think that is important to the a cultural transformation in relation to the vision of the protests by the society in Colombia. I think that is important take on board the presence of a vision, a super, an advance about the vision of the government as an impure actor that is corrupt, and in that way the blockades, the taking of the streets is seen as a legitimate way of protest, because the bad is the government. This vision, this transformation begins, I think, with, for example, the National Agrarian Strike of 2013, but alongside the decade, the 10 years, the mobilization increased, and in 2021, the audiences, how do you know, please, Camilo, ayúdame por favor a traducir esto. La gente ya estaba acostumbrada a ver muchas protestas para el 2021.
Like people were used to see a lot of public demonstrations, or like a lot of waves of demonstrations, maybe.
Yes, and blockades was part of the landscape, but that day, I think, okay, not necessarily a landscape, but some like that.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. Lidia Lo Schiavo is not related with your presentation, Camilo Tamayo, but is related with the recent election in Colombia. Yeah. Thanks a lot to Camilo for his interesting presentation. I am wondering what can be the links and how they could be analytically assessed between this protest and the election of leftist President Gustavo Petro, who defeated the right-wing candidate Hernandez.
I'm sorry, but I also raised my hand. I don't know.
Yeah, next. Don't worry.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Lydia. As Camilo mentioned, it is necessary to take into account what the peace agreements implies. In addition to that, I think there are two links. One is cultural, as I said, the positioning of a civil discourse and the decline of a work classification within society has allowed demands to be positioned in public debate, and Gustavo Petro embodies these demands. And another link is the continuity of the and positioning of the social actors and civic solidarity in in Colombia, because the last 10 years protests, during these last 10 years protests, many actors, social sectors have organized, and they have managed to translate the social power into cultural and political one.
Thank you. Some? Magdet? So Magdet, please.
Yes. Question primarily for Camilo, but Juan Camilo might also have some thoughts on this. Apologies, gentlemen, I didn't see all the presentations as I had an incident in the middle of the panel, so you may have already dealt with this. But I was just wondering if Camilo, you mentioned the sites of action that the protesters in 2021 congregated at, and I was wondering, were any of those sites or particular locations also significant during the armed conflict? In other words, did these kind of places have an existing significance, or that sort of resonated with certain sections of Colombian society? Because what we see in places like Ireland with these sort of social movements is a lot of the times they'll meet or congregate in locations that have significance with relation to, for example, the War of Independence against the British and things like that. And so often these are very deliberate choices. And I was wondering if there was any of that dynamic and evidence in the Colombian case. Apologies if you already covered this, by the way.
Thank you, Sean, for your question. And this is really interesting because I want to say that the main demonstrations happen in places that I would say or traditional places of exclusion, and when people have suffering the worst from the armed conflict. So when I address places like Cali is a county in Colombia where a lot of Afro-Colombians live, and it's a places with a lot of inequality and a lot of poverty. And of course, I think it's a correlation between the dynamics of the collective action, the dynamic of the protest, and how these communities have been suffering for decades, for a lot of decades of poverty and exclusion. So I guess I think you're totally right. I think you can see a correlation, a direct relationship between these places of exclusion and poverty and the dynamics of the protesters. But I want to say is just maybe when you are asking this, Sean, it's like how these dynamics can recreate a different configurations and narratives regarding the other. And I think that can connect with why Petro, our first left president, is now in charge, because the demonstrations in 2021 start to create a new narrative and a new representation about the other that is not necessarily related with the dynamics of the armed conflict. And we're speaking about people that are poor and excluded, but are not directly linked with any of the guerrilla groups, for example. So I think these representations and these social constructions about the other, thanks to the mobilizations and of course happening in that particular spaces and places, was one of the main consequences that Petro is now our president in Colombia. So I guess it could be really interesting to start seeing the dynamics of the mobilizations, the dynamic of the conflict, and how they can reconfigure new narratives and new representations about the other. But I guess Juan Camilo can help me as well.
I say that in effect the narratives of others and the narratives about what democracy is the important thing that is positioning in Colombia in recent years, and the critique of framework in what other any action of protest or opposition to the government was seen like a war action from insurgencies. This vision had changed and allowed that the people that people could be more open to new demands of changes.
Thank you both.
Okay, thanks. Lydia has the hand up. You want to?
Thank you very much. Yes, I appreciate so much the analytical framework that Camillo devised about, these two analytical dimensions. On one side, we have practices. On the other side, normative, dimension. But also, I appreciate so much because it resonates in my mind with the work of Judith Butler, because you propose this framework, bodies of resistance, and she wrote years ago, bodies in alliance and the politics of the street. And it seems that a trans feminist attitude to mobilization has become, you know, diffused in the repertoire of action, of mobilization. I do agree with your explanation, I mean, about the relationship between the remobilization of the public space and the electoral, you know, effects, because also we have had a previous global cycle, anti-austerity protests, and actually this cycle had electoral effects in Spain or even in Greece, in Italy, but different effects, of course, that need to be assessed, of course, differently in a comparative perspective. But like, you know, of course, it is another stuff, you know, electoral politics and social movements. But if we think of the reactivation of the public space, maybe this can be, you know, one of the effects of the social movements that can be analyzed, because for instance, the 68, you know, in the 20th century movements has produced many change transformations, but that can be also assessed in the long run. They do not need to be immediate. I mean, just the changing of our minds, our attitude to, you know, for instance, about feminism and, you know, change in customs and cultural and so on and so forth. So thank you for your illuminating presentation.
Could I agree something? I think that the repetition of protests, the incursion in the public space have allowed to learning in one, the ways of protest, and two, the way to achieve legal, political, and institutional changes. bec- I think, say that because of the reference of Butler and the importance of everyday performance in Butler. Mhm.
Yeah, I just want to say something really quick, and is, of course, one of the theme of this conference is the challenges for social movements, and I think Lydia is provoking something really interesting to analyze in the future how this, as she said, reactivation of public space can be I don't know, can be affect or can have a link or whatever, has a link with democratic expressions like, I don't know, like go to voting or new governments and so on. So I guess this. Let me rephrase this. Trying to analyze the challenge, analyzing the challenging of understanding this link between the reactivation of public spaces and this political dimension of the reactivation of public spaces can be seen as a new agenda of work, I think. Let me think about this further, and I will give you a better output later. But I'm just thinking about the challenges. So thank you, Lydia.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are in time. I would like to thank all the participants and the presenters, of course. Thank you very much for the contribution to this fifth session. And now we have 10, 12 minutes to is tea time in Britain. So, or you can take coffee or whatever, and we're back in 10 minutes to the sixth session. Okay.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you both, all, Benjamin and Camilo, and all the participants.